Welcome back to everyone in our audience. Thanks for joining us. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome Gary Gooden, Chief Technology and Security Officer at Seattle Children's Health. Mr. Gooden, welcome. Great to see you.
Great to see you. Thank you so much for having me here
Absolutely.
today.
And hopefully in a year we'll see you in person. So thank you.
Exactly.
So let's just begin at the beginning. Let's have you introduce yourself briefly to our audience. Tell us about your role and your team, and a little bit about basic stats about Seattle Children's as well. Thank you.
Certainly. So, hi again. My name is Gary Gooden. I'm the Chief Technology and Security Officer for Seattle Children's. Seattle Children's is a multi-state health system. We cover Washington, Alaska, Montana, Idaho. We're a three-practice organization. We have a clinical care business, a pediatric research business, and our foundation leg for fundraising and types of activities. I'm responsible for the security and incident response program here at Children's, in addition to our identity and access management program, and also for a large part of our infrastructure services program that covers things like networking, circuits, our virtualized environment, our server infrastructure, backup infrastructure, storage infrastructure, as well, our Active Directory and domain structures, and all of our multi-factor practices, in addition to which we also have an IT construction team that manages, in conjunction with our construction group, all construction projects here at Seattle Children's, in addition to which I'm also responsible for a cyber physical footprint as well for the organization.
Wonderful. Yeah, and how many people do you have on your team altogether?
Within the cybersecurity team, inclusive of the IAM team, it oscillates up and down. So it's about 25 people. On the infrastructure side of the house, it's roughly about 120 people, plus or minus, and also includes some contract workforce members. So all in, it's about 145, 150 in the team.
Great, thank you. So let's talk a little bit about the pandemic. As we all know, the entire world had to quickly shift gears almost 2 years ago, March, and a lot happened very quickly. What was that experience like at Seattle Children's? How did you and your team lead activity at that moment?
So at the start of the pandemic, back in March of 2020, I didn't have responsibility for infrastructure teams at that point. I was the CISO. I joined Seattle Children's in March of 2019. Mm-hmm. By November of 2020, I had assumed responsibility for infrastructure teams as well. However, when COVID really got into high gear back in March of 2020, collectively between our security and infrastructure teams, we pivoted the workforce to a remote program. Mm-hmm. And by that, I mean, we had to increase our number of virtualized licenses for things like Citrix. We had to bolster up our VPN infrastructure and quickly utilize whatever resources we had being held in reserve to provide for more capacity per session within our VDI environment for remote connectivity. So we literally exhausted our reserves, if you will, so as to allow the environment to pivot at record pace. So not unlike what many organizations had to do, that's what we did. In addition to which, we fully realized that the hub and spoke model, which is the historical notion of how networks were configured with a data center at the center, that's essentially gone or going the way of the dinosaurs. So we took the point of view that the edge was the home router.
Yeah.
And that being the case, or North Star really had more to do with the end user experience. And therefore, we needed to refactor the way we think about infrastructure and put security as a tip of the spear and really think about security attestation, the cloud for remote connectivity.
Absolutely. What were the biggest challenges in the moment last spring for you and your team?
Um, exactly what I said before from a security perspective, ensuring that when we did the pivot to remote work, that we were actively looking at a program to provide for security attestation. So we quickly kicked off an initiative to look at secure web gateway technologies. We were in the middle of completing our EDR upgrades. And we were also in the middle of pivoting to a new managed SIM environment so we could actually monitor said environment. In addition to which, we worked with the infrastructure teams to ensure that patching as a competence was something that was being done meticulously, given the fact that we had such a large remote work population. And to the organization's credit, they had already started a program to create a hybridized work environment, which today we have across the health practice between permanent remote workers, hybrid workers, and permanent on-site workers, depending on your job role. So
Yeah.
it was an all hands on deck type of set of activities.
Absolutely. One specific question I just thought of, many CISOs have told us that, and CISOs and CIOs have told us that one really key element has been continuous education of staff, including, of course, clinicians, as to some of the cybersecurity risks that everyone's facing right now, particularly in the pandemic, since we are in this hybridized environment. People are having to make use of tools that they might not have made use of before, and in physical environments where they might not have been before, i.e. home offices. Can you speak to the idea of continuous education of all end users?
So today we run a security awareness program in several forms. We do frequent updates through our newsletters, tips and tricks. Obviously, when we have things like Cyber Month, the month of October, you typically see an uptick in those types of communications. We also have a security awareness program component which focuses on phishing campaigns, things of that nature, training in the moment. If someone or one of their end users clicked, unfortunately, on the phished link. So it's through those modalities, inclusive of their annual training, which includes a specific cyber threat set of questions. So between those three different modalities, we tend to communicate with the staff. And typically what happens in the event of something malicious occurring within the industry, we will send out notifications to the entire house as it relates to potential threats, things that we're seeing, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say since I've been here, there's a heightened urgency in the frequency of communication, the type of communication, and the kind of campaigns that we launch to not only gauge users' educational level as it relates to security awareness, but also to just teaching and learning.
Terrific. So what do you see as the main cyber and data security challenges right now in the moment for you and your team?
So the problem I find with the cybersecurity space is that it's a space, and there is this notion that we're not in a war. I consider this to be an asymmetrical war that's been ongoing. And if you look at the threat environment, say even 2 years ago, compared to the threat environment of today, it's an exponential increase. And that being said, there's a huge disconnect between private and public corporations relative to the threats that we see. There is no formalized public-private consortium, if you will. There is no global effort relative to conduct combating the cyber threat. We have not locked down the payment modalities effectively because we don't have bank regulations in place for managing the way in which crypto payments are made. Yeah. So it's very difficult to stay ahead of, quote unquote, this wave, as it were. In addition to which, it's very difficult to defend if you have no chance of going into offense.
Yeah.
So in our space, we're continuously in a defensive mode, and it only takes one bad actor to create a really bad day for the environment. Yeah. So we try to utilize the tried and true techniques of it, defense in depth, as mechanisms to ensure that we have some sort of resiliency within the environment. And from my perspective, we still have a lot of work to do to ensure that we know where all of our data lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought I would maybe ask you two questions related to the state of the industry survey that we just did with our readers. The first has to do with network segmentation. We found that 51.49% of survey respondents have implemented some sort of network segmentation. We didn't ask them exactly what, because that would have been like 30 questions. 13.86% plan to do so. 15.84% have no plans to do so. When you look at numbers like that, so barely half have actually put something in place, and then another fifth are planning to do so. What are your thoughts on that result? To me, it seems like network segmentation is going to be incredibly important in that arsenal, in that asymmetrical war, as you mentioned.
I would tend to agree with that statement. I think what you're seeing is a combination of things. I think you're seeing organizations that historically have had problems getting funding at a executive suite and or at a board level. Problems with articulating how the funding actually translates to tangible effects on the ground for things that they can't actually see. Meaning, if there's nothing happening, then you're fine.
Right.
And problems defining what segmentation means. So maybe a percentage of the respondents, like us, for example, would have said, yes, we have some measure of segmentation because we have VLANs in place. And then some would argue, well, that's not real segmentation. Right. You have to have segmentation in the physical sense as well.
Yeah.
And then you will have those that will argue, well, if you're really serious about looking at this from a zero trust perspective, then what you're really talking about now is really microsegmentation as it relates to having software-defined networks in place, which is where I think the pivot needs to go. And it has to be done in a thoughtful way. Otherwise, it could end up being administratively cumbersome and difficult to not just maintain, but also to implement. Yeah. But I think that's why you probably see the percentages that you described. Yeah, is how I would read it.
Absolutely. And so you would agree. I'm glad you mentioned microsegmentation, because that's really where things are going, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And also, just one other question related to the survey that relates, I think, to our discussion here is we looked at backups of core systems, and similar numbers. I'm just shocked that anyone's not doing daily backups, and more specifically that there are organizations that aren't regularly auditing their regular backups. Because if you can't do that, you don't know that your backups are valid. Just thoughts on that.
So a couple of things. One, I think you're accurate in what you just said. I think it's also related to the fact that in many organizations, your cybersecurity practice is not tied to your infrastructure practices. Yeah. And what you tend to have happen, just from a historical perspective, is that you will have departmental silos in terms of prioritization of work. One set of leaders pushing back against another set of leaders in terms of what they should be doing as it relates to this risk landscape. So you have internal bureaucracies that, in my mind, end up being brakes on progress. Yeah. So one of the ways in which we address that in our environment is to essentially encapsulate all those teams under one set of leadership, which is my leadership. It does not negate the issue, and the issue is the maturation of the backup process in of itself. And for environments that have large Active Directory structures as it relates to how your domain is configured, et cetera, if you're doing if you're backing that up through your standard backup process, whether it's a multi-stage backup to DR to cloud, image backups, you should still be looking at backing up your AD environment separately, and then having the auditing in place to look at from a change audit perspective, looking at the deltas in the AD environment. So if for any reason you had, God forbid, an encryption compromise of what you thought was immutable data, and you have issues restoring, then you can actually go and rebuild, not have to rebuild your AD infrastructure by virtue of having a separate backup just for that. So that's something that we're actively doing today in terms of putting that in place. So I think that the removing the handbrake, so to speak, has really more to do with ensuring that those teams, whether it be cyber security teams and your infrastructure teams, are really working hand in glove. And the other thing is the notion that your DR teams are tied in to how you back up and how you validate restores on a systemic basis and not an ad hoc basis. Something that even in our environment, we have to keep maturing as well.
Yeah, right. And in other words, it's really about a constellation of actions and efforts and a process over time.
Correct.
Okay, right.
The only issue is that the clock is ticking and we don't know what time really means.
Yeah.
So it's not as if to say people should panic, but they should move at speed.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit. You are involved in a program that you call CISO Street. Can you just tell us about that for a moment?
I'm not necessarily involved in CISO Street as a program per se. I was asked by CISO Street to do an interview for them, which I did, and I also look at some of their blogs as well. So it's a set of group interviews that it goes across all kinds of verticals, and I tend to go on the forum and look at different interviews. And I was specifically do an interview by CISO Street, which I accepted and I did for them. So it's a separate organization that actually manages.
Oh, I see. Street. And what did you say? I'm interested in what you said.
Oh, they were asking me questions specifically about my philosophy around zero trust and what it really means. And my overriding comment was that if you don't have an identity and access management program, and if you don't have a strategic plan around how you want to go about entitlements as it relates to roles, then it's very difficult to implement zero trust. And then what does that mean for the other components of the infrastructure stack as it relates to people and their entitlements and the technology that's slave to the people? So it was more around that type of discussion.
Yeah, well, and I completely agree. You can't really be successful if you haven't implemented actual identity and access management. And it's something that people give lip service to, but they don't really, they're not always there in reality.
We have a fairly robust program, but even in that state, there's a tremendous amount of work that we have to do to bring it to a maturity level where I think it should be.
Right.
So we have
Absolutely. So what do the next 2 years look like in this space? How with intensifying threat vectors and just as one expert said, the bad guys are getting badder is a good way to put it.
I am concerned about the speed of Congress working on legislation to really tie public and private initiatives together in terms of information sharing. What happens when an entity gets compromised? Everybody goes quiet. No information shared. And what I have learned about the cybersecurity space and with cybersecurity practitioners is that they like to share information because they all understand that it's really a team sport at the end of the day. But organizationally, that doesn't necessarily translate to the way in which organizations that are compromised want to communicate out to the public. So I fully appreciate that. So I do believe that there's the need for national mandates and information sharing. I know there's a lot of work going on in Congress. My only issue is the speed at which they tend to move, which is not specific to any particular administration. It's just a governmental thing. The other issue that I think I made reference to earlier is the need to have some sort of banking regulation as it relates to how bad actors get paid. And then in addition to which, from a cyber defense perspective at a national level, actually working aggressively on proactive cyber defense measures, meaning active takedowns of things that are in progress. And then I would imagine that given the fact that we have an environment where things rapidly change from a technology perspective, that we start to see services that can actually pivot us from just being in a purely defensive mode. It's either purely defensive, or you look at your threat adversaries who are attacking you, so you can try to defend against the type of attackers that are coming at you, but more to pivot towards being more offensive. And that's why I think public-private partnerships are really important. So I think that if those things aren't in place, the rate of implementation of technology, the robustness of the way in which teams would work are going to just keep increasing. And I do think that the CISO role will keep evolving, and the role that I'm in for instance, now as a CTSO, I think is going to become the common role.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so too. We have just a moment left. Would you like to leave us with a piece of wise advice?
Yeah, plan for the worst, think for the best, and stay calm in the event of what is a very challenging landscape to operate in, and to really focus on listening to your other peers within the industries, learning from them as much as you can, admitting to your weaknesses and working on the weaknesses, communicate effectively to your board so that they understand what those weaknesses are, so that you can get the financial support that you may need.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think one of the things that we've learned in the last year and a half, especially, is being able to bring the case to the C-suite and board, and being able to be understood and appreciated in the sense that, in the sense of not being dismissed, is going to be incredibly important going forward. So,
yes, I do believe you're correct.
Thank you. Gary Gooden, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to be with you. I know we've learned a lot, and we really appreciate your time, your expertise, and your wisdom here.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and always happy to share.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you to you in our audience for viewing this session. This concludes this session. Thank you all very much, and have a great day.